Our passage today from 1 Samuel 3, 1 through 11, it gets used a lot to focus on God's calling, and it's a great passage for that. But in this case, I actually want to spend some time not focusing on Samuel and who's hearing God's call here for the first time in his life. I actually want to focus on Eli. Because Eli is a character we don't necessarily talk a lot about, but in this story, he plays a very significant role in setting Samuel up for what is next for his life. Now, Eli was the high priest at that time. He had actually encountered Samuel's mother before in the previous chapters. She wanted to have a son and was praying silently, which back then was weird. Eli asked her what she was praying for, and that's what she told him. And she was actually praying that if she had a son, she would give him back to the Lord. And lo and behold, she did. And she did. She brought him to the tabernacle where Eli was, and she handed him over to him to basically be trained as a priest. And Eli, to his credit, he probably didn't have to do this, went ahead and took Samuel in. And it's very clear here that Samuel was assisting in some capacity. He probably wasn't doing anything, major. He probably wasn't doing any sort of huge priestly actual things. But he was there. He was around Eli, and he was definitely getting some sort of training. Now, this is kind of important because when he gets his call, he's now at the location of the tabernacle, which at that time was God's house. So we see him in there, hearing God's voice, and he mistakes it and thinks that Eli, who was older at this time, was calling for him. And as the story goes on, he gets his calling and everything, and the actual prophecy that God gives him is that God is going to be doing something great in the land of Israel, but also Eli is going to receive, a really sort of terrible thing. Eli, while he was mentoring Samuel and really kind of raising him up, Eli also had two sons who he wasn't doing as good of a job with, and God was going to be bringing punishment against him. So we didn't read it in this passage, but Samuel, after he gets his been spoken to and everything, is hesitant to give the full sort of vision to Eli, and Eli eventually pries it out of him and actually has a very admirable response in saying, what God is planning on doing, let him do, which means, he was accepting, whatever God has planned here, is going to happen, and I'm going to be okay with it. So that's the full story. That's what I want us to really focus on. That's a big summary, but I think we need the context to kind of get at this, and that's specifically how Eli really went about mentoring who ended up essentially being his replacement. Samuel is considered a prophet in the scriptures. He's also considered the last judge. He's kind of that last leader. He would go on to crown both King Saul, who's the first king of Israel, and King David, who is very important because that is the entire lineage of kings that was in Israel and ultimately led to Jesus. So he plays a massive role in the part of Scripture, but Eli really doesn't. And I think a lot of times when we are, mentoring somebody, when we're going and we're trying to help them to learn something, we can find ourselves in a situation where sometimes they end up going on to greater things than we did. And it's very easy to kind of get jealous in that sort of situation. I do think it's really important to, act like Eli did and allow them, and understand that that's God's plan for them, and that's good, and that you had a part to play in that. And while you maybe you didn't get the kind of the glory and everything like that, if you hadn't have, spoken into their life and helped them in their lives, they wouldn't have probably been necessarily equipped to go about that. And this really leads me to the big point that I want to get in here, which is, and actually the most important thing, and I've saved it kind of at the end of all of this, and that is the sheer importance for all of us to reach out and help raise up the next generation. The reality is whether we like it or not, those who are coming after us, those who are kids now or my age now, depending on what your age is, those who are younger than us are going to at some point replace us. Those of a younger generation are at some point going to replace us. And we have to, even if we don't necessarily approve of them, even if we're maybe scared that they'll do more or less, we have to act like Eli and bring them in and help them to see and hear God's calling. Because how else are they going to know? How else are they going to perceive that? And we need to equip them to sort of handle that, because whether we like it or not, they are going to replace us. I don't think if Eli had, trained Samuel, if he had said no, I don't think that necessarily would have changed God's plan to use Samuel. He would have found another way, but it might not have gone exactly how things went in Scriptures. There might have been a little bit more difficulty for him. So the fact that Eli was speaking in there and that Eli was helping out in there is very significant, and we should be looking for opportunities to do that as well. And I think that is really important. I do really believe engaging, multi-generationally as the church, which is something that we really do struggle as the church. And I'm not just talking about Timonium United Methodist Church. I'm talking about the entirety of the church. Connecting between generations is incredibly important, because every generation has something to give to each other. And I genuinely believe that. And going out and reaching out, this is one way to do it. And that it's at least as a starting point, because nobody is ever going to necessarily, well, sometimes they will, but usually people are not necessarily going to go up and ask you for mentorship in that sort of way. But if you have that opportunity that lands there, you need to take it, and you need to run with it, and you need to do what you can with it. Because they're going to replace us one of these days. Unfortunately, we are not all going to be here eternally on earth until Jesus comes back again. And so we have to still prepare for that. We have to still prepare for the potential that is going to take longer, and that it's not going to happen within our lifetimes. And that means making sure that those who are coming after us are ready to answer God's call.